Sega was never supposed to be a video game company. It started in the 1940s as a small outfit supplying jukeboxes, slot machines, and coin-operated amusement equipment to American military bases scattered across Japan. That's the whole business. Not games, not consoles, vending machines for soldiers with pocket change in a country still rebuilding from the war. It took decades of quiet pivots to get from there to a company capable of standing toe-to-toe with Nintendo. A merger with a photo booth and arcade distributor run by an American businessman named David Rosen turned the operation into Sega Enterprises, and by the late 1960s, the company had gone public on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, run for a time under the ownership of the American conglomerate Gulf and Western. Through the 1960s and 70s, Sega built a real name for itself in arcades, with cabinet hits that put its logo in front of millions of players years before anyone owned a home console. This wasn't a fringe hobby business. Arcades in this era were a legitimate cultural institution in both Japan and the US. And being one of the companies that owned that space gave Sega a level of engineering credibility long before Nintendo had any reason to see it as a threat. Somewhere in that stretch, a young executive named Hayao Nakayama came aboard through an acquisition of his own import-export company. He would end up being the single most important person in Sega's history, the man who took the company to its highest point, and the same man whose decisions would later drag it back down. Nakayama eventually rose to become president of Sega's operations, and the instincts he brought with him from the arcade business, bet big, move fast, trust the hardware over the marketing, would define Sega's culture for the next 2 decades, for both better and worse. When home consoles became the business to be in, Sega jumped in at the worst possible moment. Its first system, the SG-1000, launched in Japan on July 15, 1983, the exact same day as Nintendo's Famicom, and the same year the North American games industry effectively collapsed under a flood of low-quality cartridges nobody wanted anymore. That crash wiped out huge portions of the American market almost overnight and left retailers gun-shy about stocking game consoles at all for years afterward. Nintendo clawed its way out of that wreckage by taking near-total control of everything. Strict licensing agreements that limited how many titles a publisher could release per year, tight first-party quality checks, and the final word on which games were even allowed to exist on its hardware. Within a few years, Nintendo controlled something close to 90% of the North American console market, a number so dominant it's barely been matched by anyone since. Sega's early machines, the SG-1000, then its successor the Master System, barely registered against that wall. The Master System actually found real success in markets like Brazil and parts of Europe, but in the 2 markets that mattered most, Japan and the US, it was an afterthought next to the Famicom and NES. Then Sega built the Genesis, and for the first time, the fight actually looked fair. Released in Japan in late 1988 and in North America the following year, the Genesis gave Sega something it had never had before: a real technical edge. It was a 16-bit machine going up against Nintendo's 8-bit NES. But raw horsepower wasn't moving units on its own, and Sega's American marketing wasn't landing. That changed in the fall of 1990, when Sega's leadership in Japan brought in Tom Kalinske, a toy industry veteran who had helped revive Barbie and Hot Wheels, to run the US division. Kalinske arrived with a 4-part plan that, in hindsight, is one of the sharpest strategic pivots in the entire history of the games industry. Drop the console's boring pack-in title and replace it with a mascot, built specifically to go head-to-head with Mario. Cut the price hard enough to remove the barrier standing between the console and every household that had already bought a Nintendo. rebrand the whole platform as the edgier, cooler alternative to Nintendo's family-friendly image, and push Western developers to build games that actually spoke to an American audience, instead of simply translating Japanese titles and hoping for the best. Sega's leadership in Japan wasn't thrilled about handing an American executive that much control, but they let him run with it, largely because the alternative was continuing to lose to Nintendo with no real plan. The mascot already existed in rough form internally, built around a very different personality than what eventually shipped, and after a round of revisions aimed squarely at US tastes, faster, spikier, more attitude, blue to match Sega's own logo, Sonic the Hedgehog launched in June 1991 as the new Genesis pack-in game, replacing the far more forgettable Altered Beast. Combine that with the price cut, an aggressive ad campaign built around the line "Genesis does what Nintendo don't," and Kalinski's team muscling major retailers like Walmart and Toys R Us into carrying the system on terms Nintendo would never have agreed to, and Sega pulled off something that had looked impossible only a couple of years earlier. Sega's US marketing also leaned hard into sports licensing, striking deals with athletes, and even launching a Sega Sports imprint years before that concept became an entire industry unto itself. At its peak, in 1994, the Genesis captured close to 60% of the North American 16-bit console market, close enough to Nintendo's Super Nintendo that, for a real stretch of the early 90s, nobody in the industry could confidently say who was going to win. Sega had gone from an irrelevant also-ran to Nintendo's only credible rival in less than 4 years, and it had done it by being willing to fight dirtier, cheaper, and louder than anyone thought a challenger could get away with. That's the peak worth holding onto, because everything from here is the story of how it slipped away, and not because a smarter rival outbuilt Sega. Because Sega's own leadership kept being handed its own best options and kept saying no, Sega's biggest strength during the Genesis years doubled as its biggest long-term liability, a near-compulsive need to be first. First with new technology. First with a new format. First to make the move Nintendo was too cautious to make. That instinct is exactly what produced Sonic. It's also what produced two of the earliest cracks in the company's foundation. The first was the Sega CD, an add-on released in 1992 that let the Genesis play games off compact discs instead of cartridges. The pitch made sense on paper. CDs held vastly more data than cartridges, which meant room for full-motion video and soundtracks cartridges physically couldn't handle. What actually showed up on shelves was a library dominated by grainy, low-budget interactive movies of wildly inconsistent quality, priced closer to a whole new console than a simple accessory. The Sega CD wasn't a disaster by the numbers. It sold reasonably well as add-ons go, but it was the first moment a meaningful chunk of Sega's most loyal fans felt like they'd paid a premium for a glimpse of the future and gotten a stack of mediocre FMV games instead. The second crack was the Game Gear. Sega's handheld launched in 1991 to go head-to-head with Nintendo's Game Boy. On paper, it was the more impressive machine by a wide margin. Full-color screen, a backlight, even a TV tuner accessory that let you watch broadcast television on a handheld in 1991, years before that kind of feature showed up anywhere else. But all of that came at a brutal cost. Battery life so poor, the system could chew through a full set of 6 AA batteries in a few hours of play, next to a Game Boy that could run for tens of hours on the same handful of batteries thanks to its far less power-hungry black and white screen. Once again, Sega had built the more technically ambitious product, and once again, it lost out to something simpler, cheaper to actually use, and better suited to how kids really played, sitting in a car, on a long trip, without a parent needing to stop every few hours to buy more batteries. There's a pattern worth naming explicitly here, because it's going to repeat at a much larger scale later in this story. In both the Sega CD and the Game Gear, Sega's engineers solved the problem they were most excited to solve: more storage, more color, more processing power, instead of the problem consumers actually had, which was reliability, affordability, and ease of use. Nintendo, for all the criticism it took for being conservative and restrictive, consistently built toward the second kind of problem. That gap in philosophy is the quiet thread running underneath everything that happens for the rest of the decade. Neither of these products killed Sega. Nobody was writing the company's obituary in 1992, but both quietly locked in a pattern that would define the rest of the decade. An instinct to leap first and figure out the details later, producing hardware that looked incredible on a spec sheet and fell apart in people's actual hands. And that pattern was about to collide head-on with the most consequential set of decisions in Sega's entire history. Decisions that had nothing to do with Nintendo and everything to do with a partner Sega had sitting right across the table and chose, twice, not to take. By the early 1990s, Sega needed a real next-generation console. And the company that would eventually go build that console for the entire industry was already in the room, twice. The first opening came from Sony. Sega and Sony had already worked together once, collaborating on pieces of the Sega CD hardware, so there was a genuine, functioning relationship between the two companies already. Tom Kalinske pushed hard to formalize that relationship into something much bigger, a joint venture in which Sony would help manufacture Sega's next console, with each company developing and profiting from its own software on the platform. Given how strong Sega's in-house development reputation was at the time, Kalinske believed this could be enormously profitable for both sides. Sega's leadership in Japan, under Nakayama, rejected it outright. They wanted to build their own hardware independently, without ceding an inch of control to an outside partner, even a partner they'd already trusted enough to work with once before. Sony, notably, had already been burned in almost this exact position. The company had originally partnered with Nintendo to build a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, only to have Nintendo quietly abandon that deal and sign a separate agreement with Philips behind Sony's back. Freshly spurned by Nintendo, Sony turned to Sega, figuring the prior collaboration made this the obvious next step. Sega turned them down too. With both of the industry's dominant console makers having now rejected it as a partner, Sony made the decision that would end up handing it dominance over the entire industry for the next decade. It built its own console, alone. That console launched in Japan in 1994 and in North America in 1995 as the PlayStation. The second opening was, if anything, even more damning in hindsight. Kalinske also pushed Sega to license a chipset from Silicon Graphics, a company whose technology offered real advantages in speed, graphics, and audio processing for whatever came after the Genesis. Sega's leadership in Japan turned that down too, choosing instead to build its own proprietary architecture for what would become the Saturn. That Silicon Graphics chipset didn't just disappear once Sega passed on it. It became the foundation of Nintendo's next console, the Nintendo 64. Sit with that for a second. The two companies that would go on to define the next full generation of console gaming, Sony with the PlayStation, Nintendo with the N64, both built their winning hardware on relationships and technology that Sega had direct access to and personally walked away from. Sega didn't lose the next generation because it lacked options. It lost because the same company that had spent years correctly betting on bold, unconventional moves to build the Genesis suddenly got conservative and insular at the exact moment boldness would have mattered the most. It's worth asking why. Part of it was straightforward pride. Sega had just spent the better part of 5 years clawing its way from irrelevance to something close to parity with Nintendo, and Nakayama's generation of leadership had built that climb on the belief that Sega's engineering was good enough to stand entirely on its own. Handing manufacturing or core chip architecture to an outside partner, even a friendly one, read internally as an admission that Sega couldn't finish the job itself. Part of it was also a genuine, reasonable fear about losing control of margins and intellectual property in a joint venture. Those are legitimate business concerns, and Sega's caution wasn't irrational on its face. The problem wasn't that Sega asked hard questions about the Sony deal. The problem was that having asked those questions, the answer it landed on was to go it alone against two competitors who, as history would show, were both about to get extremely good at exactly what Sega chose to walk away from. There's also a timeline detail that makes the rejection sting even more in hindsight. Sony didn't walk away from the CD-ROM project with Nintendo and immediately decide to build a console from scratch out of ambition. By most accounts, Sony's leadership at the time was genuinely unsure whether the games business was even worth pursuing as a standalone venture. It had just been humiliated by Nintendo's about-face and had a working relationship with Sega that could have made the whole PlayStation project unnecessary. Sega saying no didn't just cost it a manufacturing partner. It removed the one off-ramp that might have kept Sony out of the hardware business entirely and pushed a company with deep pockets and wounded pride toward building a competitor from the ground up instead. Instead, Sega's leadership in Japan pushed forward alone on the Saturn, building genuinely complex hardware around dual Hitachi SH2 CPUs and a stack of additional specialized processors for graphics, sound, and video handling, technically ambitious on a spec sheet and notoriously brutal for outside developers to actually program for in practice. Getting the Saturn's two processors to work together efficiently required a level of low-level optimization that most third-party studios simply didn't have the time or expertise to pursue, which meant many multi-platform games shipped on Saturn running noticeably worse than their PlayStation counterparts, even when the Saturn's raw specifications were arguably comparable or better in isolated areas. A console is not just its transistors. It's also how easy it is for a working studio on a deadline to actually get a game running on it. And on that measure, the Saturn was losing before it even launched. And here's where the deeper structural problem in how Sega made decisions becomes impossible to ignore. For years, the company's entire success had depended on its Japanese leadership, largely deferring to Sega, of America's red on the Western market, letting Kalinske cut the price, rebrand the console, and build Sonic. By the time the Saturn was in development, that balance of power had flipped. Japan held the reins now, and the division that had actually delivered Sega's one real victory over Nintendo was increasingly locked out of the decisions that mattered most. Kalinske had correctly identified two separate paths that could have kept Sega genuinely competitive into the next console generation. He was overruled on both. What Sega got instead was a console built largely in isolation, about to launch into a market Sega itself was already busy destabilizing with a rushed stopgap product landing in that exact same window. While the Saturn was still deep in development, Sega also rushed out the 32X, a cheaper add-on for existing Genesis owners, meant to stretch the aging console's life while the Saturn finished cooking. It launched with a thin library and almost no real developer support, largely because studios were already redirecting their attention toward the Saturn that was coming right behind it. Anyone who bought a 32X in late 1994 was, within months, watching Sega quietly walk away from the exact product it had just sold them. Then came the moment that turned quiet frustration into open anger. The first ever Electronic Entertainment Expo, May 1995. Sega's American president walked on stage and announced that the Saturn wasn't launching that fall like everyone had been told. It was launching that day. Immediately. Available for purchase right then, months ahead of schedule. For a brief moment, it looked like a masterstroke. Seize the headlines. Get ahead of Sony's looming PlayStation launch by a full 4 months. Own the narrative before Sony even had a chance to speak. And in a cruel twist, it was Sony that got the last laugh on stage that same show. When Sony's own executive walked up shortly after to announce the PlayStation's price, he reportedly just said the number, $299, and walked off. A moment that's been replayed in gaming retrospectives ever since as one of the most quietly devastating pieces of stagecraft in console history, precisely because it stood in such stark contrast to Sega's chaotic surprise launch approach minutes earlier. Instead of the coup Sega had planned, the surprise announcement completely bypassed the retail partners Sega actually needed on board. Stores that hadn't been looped in had no stock ready, no marketing prepared, no warning that the store down the street might already have units on shelves and theirs didn't. Some major retailers, furious at being blindsided on a decision that directly hit their business, simply refused to carry the console at launch at all. And meanwhile, customers who'd been holding on to a barely year-old 32X, waiting for some kind of guidance on when it was actually worth upgrading, found themselves staring at a Saturn that had appeared out of nowhere, while the hardware Sega had sold them just months earlier was already, unmistakably, a dead end. It's worth sitting on how much internal dysfunction this one sequence reveals. Sega's Japanese leadership had already overruled its own American division on the 2 partnerships that could have produced a stronger, easier-to-develop-for console. Now Sega of America's leadership, in turn, made a launch decision so poorly coordinated it alienated the exact retail network the console depended on to survive. This wasn't one bad actor making one bad call. It was 2 halves of the same company, increasingly out of sync with each other, each one making decisions that made the other's job harder. The fallout came fast. Tom Kalinske, the man who had engineered Sega's entire golden era and who had correctly pushed for both the Sony partnership and the Silicon Graphics deal, left the company in 1996, having watched 2 clear paths to relevance get rejected by the leadership sitting above him. His replacement, Bernie Stolar, inherited a console that internal leadership had already more or less written off. By 1997, at that year's E3, Stolar said it out loud on stage, in public, the Saturn was not Sega's future. The console had been on shelves for barely 2 years, and the company running it had just told the entire industry, and every fan who'd bought one, not to bother investing in it any further. You do not get a console's momentum back after your own president publicly declares it dead. Developers stopped committing resources. Retailers deprioritized shelf space even further, and the fans who had stuck with Sega through the Sega CD's mediocre FMV library, the Game Gear's battery problem, and the whiplash of the 32X to Saturn transition were told, in essence, that their loyalty had once again been misplaced. By the numbers, the Saturn sold somewhere in the range of 9 to 10 million units worldwide over its lifetime. That's not nothing. Plenty of hardware in gaming history would have called that a respectable run. But the PlayStation, over roughly the same window, sold more than 100 million units. This wasn't a close fight that Sega narrowly lost. It was a rout, and the margin of that rout is the clearest evidence available that the Saturn's struggles weren't really about the Saturn at all. They were the accumulated cost of every decision that came before it, the partnerships turned down, the launch that alienated retailers, and a leadership structure that had stopped functioning as one coordinated company right when it needed to function as one the most. Nakayama himself would eventually step down from Sega's presidency in 1998, closing out the same run that had once made him the architect of Sega's rise. It's a genuinely rare thing in corporate history to watch one person preside over both a company's greatest triumph and its most self-inflicted collapse within the same decade. But that's precisely what happened here. The Genesis years and the Saturn years weren't really two different eras with two different sets of problems. They were the same leadership philosophy: total confidence in Sega's own engineering, deep discomfort with ceding control to outsiders, succeeding wildly in one context and failing catastrophically in the next. To Sega's credit, the story doesn't end in quiet surrender. In 1999, the company launched the Dreamcast, genuinely ahead of its time, with built-in online connectivity years before that became standard, and one of the strongest launch lineups the industry had seen, including Sonic Adventure and Soul Calibur. For a moment, it actually looked like Sega might pull off one more improbable comeback. The Dreamcast's launch numbers actually backed that momentum up at first. It set records for the fastest-selling console in US history up to that point, moving hundreds of thousands of units in its opening weeks. For a moment, the company that had spent the back half of the 1990s apologizing for itself looked like it might actually pull off a real second act. But the console landed into a market still shaped by everything that came before it. Retailers who'd been burned by the chaotic Saturn rollout hedged their commitments this time around, ordering conservatively even as demand outpaced supply. Consumers who'd watched Sega publicly walk away from its own hardware on stage at E3 just 2 years earlier approached the new console with a caution the Genesis-era Sega had never had to fight through. Sega was also still carrying real financial damage from the Saturn years, which meant it had far less runway to absorb a slow stretch than a company like Sony did. And then Sony, now the dominant force Sega had twice declined to build with, launched the PlayStation 2 in March 2000, a machine that could also play DVDs at a moment when DVD players were still expensive standalone purchases for most households, instantly making the PS2 a compelling all-in-one buy in a way the Dreamcast simply couldn't compete with, no matter how strong its game library was. There was, remarkably, one more door that opened during this stretch, and it's the one that closes the loop on this entire story. Microsoft sent a team to study Sega's console business directly and reportedly explored putting an early version of Windows onto the Dreamcast, with some conversations even touching on a deeper partnership between the two companies, at a moment when Microsoft was actively looking for a way into the console market it didn't yet have any presence in. It came to nothing substantial. Sega, a company that had already turned down Sony twice on the hardware that became the PlayStation and the N64, let a potential relationship with Microsoft slip by too. A relationship that, a few years later, would help Microsoft launch the Xbox and enter console gaming as a serious third player, backed by resources Sega could only have dreamed of by that point in its history. Look at the shape of that pattern across the whole decade. Sony wanted in on the next Sega console and was told no. Silicon Graphics wanted its chipset in the next Sega console and was told no. Microsoft wanted some form of partnership around the Dreamcast and got, at best, a polite dead end. 3 separate companies, 3 separate points in Sega's history, all approaching Sega first, all wanting to build something together, and all 3 eventually went on to become defining forces in gaming, precisely because Sega turned them away. It's genuinely hard to find another company in modern business history that had this many separate, unconnected opportunities to shape an entire industry's future handed to it directly and said no to every single one. In 2001, after 18 years in the console business, Sega announced it was stepping away from hardware entirely, discontinuing the Dreamcast and refocusing the company purely on developing and publishing games, the business it still operates in today, from the Yakuza series to Sonic titles that, in one of gaming history's stranger turns, now show up inside Nintendo's own crossover games, like Super Smash Bros. Sonic himself made his console-exclusive debut on a Nintendo platform not long after, running alongside Mario in a crossover that would have been unthinkable during the Genesis Does What Nintendo Don't years. A quiet, almost poetic epilogue to a rivalry that had once defined an entire generation of childhoods. The financial toll of the hardware years was severe. Sega posted enormous losses across the Saturn and Dreamcast period, and the decision to exit hardware wasn't really a choice made from strength. It was closer to a company recognizing it had run out of runway to keep competing at that level after nearly a decade of self-inflicted wounds. What's remarkable is that the games themselves were rarely the problem. Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio. The Dreamcast's library is still remembered fondly today, decades later, as one of the more creatively fertile stretches in console gaming history. Sega could clearly still make things people wanted. What it couldn't do, again and again, was make the business decisions around those things land the way they needed to. It would be simpler to tell this as a story about Sony just outbuilding Sega, better hardware, better marketing, a rival too strong to beat. That version requires no accountability and no uncomfortable questions. But it isn't what happened. Sega didn't lose to a competitor that outmaneuvered it from the outside. Sega had the PlayStation, in an early form, offered to it directly by Sony. Sega had the hardware that became the N64, offered to it directly by Silicon Graphics. Sega had a potential future with Microsoft, right as the Dreamcast was fighting for its life. Every one of those doors was opened from the inside by companies that specifically wanted to work with Sega, and every one of them was closed by Sega itself, usually by Japanese leadership overruling the American division that had delivered the company's only real victory over Nintendo in the first place. Sega didn't lose the console war to Sony's genius. Sega had genuine, repeated chances to help build the console that beat it, turned them down out of a need to control everything independently, and then watched every partner it rejected go on to define the next decade of gaming without it. That's not a story about being outcompeted. That's a story about a company that, at the exact moment it had the most leverage it would ever have, chose isolation over the partnerships that had already made it great, and spent the rest of its history in consoles paying for that choice. And maybe that's the part of this story that lingers longest. Sega's fall wasn't a single bad product, or a single bad year. It wasn't even really about Sonic being slower than Mario, or the Saturn being harder to code for than the PlayStation. Underneath every one of those individual failures sits the same root decision, made and remade across nearly a decade. The choice, every single time a partner showed up at the door, to close it. The Genesis years proved Sega could win by being willing to bend, to compromise, to let an American executive tear up the playbook and rebuild the company from the outside in. The decade that followed proved what happens when that same company forgets the lesson that got it there in the first place.